Welcome to CISO Chair, where true cyber leadership, real stories, and industry insights take center stage. This is your seat at the table.
Post-Trump deregulation accelerates M&A activity, yet 85% of deals still fail to deliver expected value, with cybersecurity integration consistently ranking as the leading risk factor. HP's $14 billion acquisition of Juniper Networks, announced in January 2024, successfully navigated 18 months of Department of Justice antitrust review, national security evaluation, and strategic portfolio rationalization to close in July 2025, positioning HPE as a leader in AI native networking against Cisco and Huawei. Welcome to CISO Chair, where I, your host Ashish, brings you strategic conversation with cybersecurity's most accomplished leaders. Today's episode features Mr. Drew Simonis, the cybersecurity executive who successfully guided Juniper Networks security programs through HPE's transformative acquisition. Drew has delivered zero trust architectures at global enterprise scale, built high performance security organizations through principled, empathy driven leadership, expertly managed prolonged crisis scenarios, and mastered strategic risk orchestration in high velocity environments. Drew also turns out to be my ex boss, so it is awesome to be catching up with him today.
Very much so.
Security leaders, CISOs architecting M&A security strategies, AI governance leaders, and channel executives will find this podcast a definitive executive playbook. Drew, thank you so much for accepting this invitation and welcome to CISO Chair.
Thank you. I'm super thrilled to be here. As you point out, I've missed our opportunities to connect with each other since we're no longer working together, and it's really nice to be able to spend a little time with you today.
Thank you so much once again. So, quickly start. I am curious to know how and when did your cybersecurity journey begin, and what keeps you excited for all these years to be around, and what was that trait that helped you be a high achiever in terms of running bigger security programs?
Yeah, well, I started in cybersecurity like many people in the CISO chair a long time ago, 25 plus years ago. And when I started in the industry, there really wasn't the kind of doctrine around cybersecurity that we see today. There wasn't established best practices. There wasn't really even much of an industry beyond firewalls and antivirus. And I got to grow with the industry. And from a time where you made your own tools if you had a problem to solve, through to where there are now multi-billion-dollar corporations supporting us as professionals. And that evolution has produced no end of excitement and opportunities to grow as the profession was evolving, as business transformation was occurring. We got to ride along with that as practitioners, and that was just always exciting. Different puzzles to solve, sometimes just different contexts for the same puzzle, different solutions to work with, and it was all consequential, increasingly so. We went from data breaches to ransomware to nation state actors, and with each evolution, the stakes became higher, the importance of our function to the businesses we support increased, and the profile of leadership went with that. So, it's never been a dull moment, as they say, and that's kept me really engaged throughout the years. I think the thing, if I thought about like what has helped me be super successful to the extent that I am like your intro was wonderful. I should have you follow me around and repeat that. It's like a real confidence builder, but I've struggled as well as succeeded. And I think being in positions where I was candid about my struggles and willing to accept them and to take advice from people who were either more successful or better positioned than I was, and listened and heed that advice as well as I could, rather than resisting it and saying like, no, I'm actually doing better. You don't understand how well I'm doing. That kind of self-awareness and willingness to improve and willingness to have others help you improve, that invites them into your career. And people like helping people. That's human nature. People aren't necessarily selfish and self-interested. They're very generous and they're willing to share their experiences and to help you along. So, being willing to be coached and to be led helps you, I think, become a better coach and a better leader.
Thank you for that. And you did mention about technology evolution, ransomware, global compliance landscape changing in many ways. To come to the theme of this conversation, where and how do you think mergers and acquisitions ramp up the complexity And from your experience, what have you found easier or harder with NAs in general?
Well, I think for one, a lot of companies who are in the midst of some sort of merger, acquisition, or divestiture, it's not necessarily something they do regularly. And so they don't have an established muscle, a set of playbooks, a lot of discipline, and a real practice in how to do that. And so what is already, even in the best cases, an uncertain environment, whether it's regulatory reviews, whether it's just the cultural clashes that invariably happen even in companies that seem very well suited to each other, the technical integrations that become much more difficult. All that is happening under tremendous pressure to close and execute a deal on a time frame to realize the value of the transactions. So you take something that is really high stakes, really kind of a pressure cooker, and you put a bunch of people in it who don't deal with that regularly, and that is a recipe for some sort of controlled chaos, a popcorn machine or something like that. Some companies are fortunate in that they do a lot of acquisitions or a lot of mergers, and they do have those playbooks well documented and practiced and polished. But even those companies run into surprises. They may be better situated to cope with the surprises because they expect them, but they still are going to have to cope with them. And those coping mechanisms could be delays in projects, they could be overruns in cost, they could be a failure to realize value. And those are all consequential in the context of a merger for sure.
And as 2026 deregulated M&A environment demands immediate cybersecurity leadership, what are the day one integration risks that demand CISO's immediate attention, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I think there's two things. From a pure security perspective, you have attackers who are aware of the chaos that we just discussed and know that they can target the individuals in the companies. A lot of people, for example, are going to be getting communications from people they haven't communicated with before about things they haven't communicated, and so everything from you need to go enroll in your benefits to here's how you enroll in maybe our single sign-on systems or get access to a critical business processing system, whatever that might be. There's all sorts of this enrollment activity that's taking place, and there's also a lot of decisions being made, things that are happening outside of the normal processes. Maybe an executive needs a very quick review of a contract or a lot of information about some sort of pending transaction that's material to the acquisition or the divestiture. And so like you have all this stuff that is abnormal. Back to that point about people not being disciplined and drilled, they're going to find attackers trying to take advantage of that, sending very targeted phishing emails that may seem like genuine parts of that transaction. And people are going to be so eager to support the speed of a transaction that they're not going to have the time to stop and think, is this something I should be clicking on? So all the things we teach people become much more difficult under pressure. So on one hand, you have that whole security dynamic, and then on the other hand, you've got the reality of the business transaction itself. It's going to be focused on how can we very quickly look like one company, whether that's to our customers, to our market, or to our regulators, or whoever that is you need to prove that to. How can you get the acquisition and the integration complete enough that we can begin transacting together, for example, in a sales context? And that is going to be something that cybersecurity is important to, but not necessarily material to. And so you're going to see a lot of people working outside of the context of the cyber oversight as they're rushing towards their goals. And you're going to have to find a way to come alongside those teams and support them because they don't have time to slow down to do it your way. And so it's more like, how can we do what you need to do while we're running? The old analogy of changing the tires as you're driving the car comes to mind.
And that kind of also makes me wonder, like, how do you establish cybersecurity as a value accelerator rather than a constraint in these high stake transactions with already so much going on all at once?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, you've got to understand where the value is. That takes a lot of work, and for some cyber leaders, they're not in the conversation to realize those things. So if you take a step back, you've got to you got to be seen as someone who supports business value creation. Because if you're not, they're not going to believe that you are focused on that when the transaction is in the process. a lot of it is groundwork you've got to start laying and making sure that as a security leader, that is your reputation within the company. And if it is, people will be more willing to pull you into the conversations. And then it's about managing risk versus driving compliance. Driving compliance tends to put you at odds with these transactional activities because, there might be some trade-offs that need to be made by the business leadership in order to deliver on some sort of integration target or acquisition goal in general. And so you've got to be very confident in saying it might not be perfect, but it's good enough, and we can deliver that, because that's what, like, the business wants to operate, and they want to feel safe that they're making decisions that aren't going to catastrophically impact their broader goals. And so, you definitely don't want to enable that, but you also don't want to be on the other side stopping things for that 1 in a million risk that we so often think is inevitable, and we might be a little miscalibrated.
So, Drew, you have successfully implemented zero trust architectures across global enterprises. When merging organizations face converging technology stacks and product portfolio overlaps, what are your foundational steps for unifying their security architectures?
Yeah, well, we went through this, and in the context of the recent transaction that I was a party to, I was fortunate. I got to kind of watch the other company, the acquiring company, go through this too, and observe their best practices and learn from those. And I think the path they followed would be one I'd recommend. You first and foremost, you kind of look at who's more mature, who has a better capability. Can you learn from the acquired company? Do they have something that will scale to the acquiring company? And if so, is it at a level of maturity that you want to preserve that? That's important because you don't want to show up to the acquired company and hit them with a blowtorch and just burn everything down. That doesn't make that team feel like that they're valued, that they've done good work, that their outputs are respected. So it's good to look for opportunities to reuse what the acquired company has built. The natural tendency for most acquiring companies is just say, do it our way. And so it was nice to see the openness to appreciate what had been built. Is there something we could just use? And then you look at cost. Did you have a better deal than we did? If we're using similar technologies, like everyone's using firewalls, everyone's using EDR, everyone's using a SIM, who's got the better licensing costs? Can we save the company money? So I think those two criteria are important. Who's got the more mature process? Is that process scalable across the combined company? And will it be cost effective if we do that? That's a really cool and simple lens to look through to make that decision.
Thank you for that. And I'm glad you touched upon business and priorities in the earlier section, which kind of brings me to the next point of channel partners often experience uncertainty during extended acquisition timelines. Now, what communication framework do you recommend that CISOs use to build partner and sales team confidence in cybersecurity direction and priorities?
It's a challenging question because channels are so important, I think, to the companies that rely on them. They act like the advocate for the company's products into the marketplace, and in many cases are the main driver of sales and revenue growth. So you definitely want to make sure that your channel feels confident. And to the extent that the product that you have or the services you're offering are cyber involved, that's going to drive your level of engagement. If you're delivering a SaaS offering, for example, and your cyber function is looking after your cloud infrastructure, you want to make sure that the people involved with your customer, whether it's your sales team or your channel or whoever, that they understand what likely questions are going to be coming from your customers, that they have a set of answers that give them the ability to credibly respond to those questions, and that they have the confidence to engage in the conversation that might follow. There's nothing worse than somebody asks you a question, you regurgitate an answer, and they go for maybe a follow-up or a clarification, and you have to be like, oh, look at the time. So, you want to have that kind of engagement where people understand. And it's good for cyber because we can play the role of the customer. These are questions we would ask of our suppliers to understand what are the likely impacts to security that may arise in this transaction, and what are you doing about them? So like we can role play the role of customer, we can brainstorm what those questions might be, then we can help develop the answers, and then we can help teach people how to use those answers effectively to build confidence in the market.
Thank you for that. Building and maintaining leadership continually defines long term success. What are your proven strategies for hiring, training, and retaining high caliber cybersecurity talent during periods of organizational transition and uncertainty, as you may have seen in recent past?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about talent growth and retention, I think it's got to be a real focus on a pipeline, mobility, the ability to grow, and the ability to support the interests and aspirations and ambitions of your team. If you're not delivering a talent pipeline that allows people to feel like their ambitions are being satisfied, and you're just sort of, I don't know, like growing people for your own purposes, and that's going to be seen as selfish. It's not going to be seen as genuine. So you just want to make sure, one, you understand what people's talent level is, like where are you now, where do you want to go, and how are we going to work together to get you there. And that works in pretty much any context. It's not as simple to execute on as it is to say, but I think it's as leaders that there's probably not much more important than knowing the answer to those three questions for our teams. We really have to, I think focus on the development of our teams, and then delivering on those ambitions, and giving them the progress that they need to feel their careers are growing.
So we know resource optimization becomes mission critical immediately post merger. Do you have a structure around how to deliver and quantify and reduce risks without requiring additional budget or headcount post merger?
Yeah, well, I think it's often the other way, right? That you are going to have less headcount, and not necessarily because you're eliminating people, but people are going to be pulled in a lot of different directions, and people are going to be assigned to projects that support the broader integration rather than your own cyber program. So, there's going to be a lot of new work for potentially a long time after a transaction closes. And so you better be able to really understand what your level of risk is. Back to that, you've got to be seen as a trusted party by your counterparts before these things happen. You have to understand where your business's risk appetite is, because you're never going to be able to show up with a leader post a transaction and say, "Oh, I'd love to sit down and talk to you about your risk appetite or your business priorities," because they're going to be up to their eyeballs in unplanned work themselves. So these are things you have to understand. You've got to, at best, validate assumptions about how those things have changed. So, it's a lot easier for somebody to react than it is for them to create. And so you can, for example, say, look, we talked about your risks last year. These were the main concerns you had. This is how we thought we were managing them, et cetera. Based on this transaction, we think they've changed like this. Do you agree with those conclusions? And they can sort of nod or shake their head. And that's like, that makes it easy for them to participate and contribute to your risk analysis. And then, as with anything, risk is a trade-off. So you've got to focus on those risks that rise to the very top. And that might mean, as a security leader, you have to put some things that you were prioritizing on the back burner and make that risk trade-off, because new urgent work has come in, or new critical work has come in. Something else is going to be bubbled down, and you got to be comfortable making that trade-off. The worst thing you can do to your team is to try to just pile it all on and say, well, look, this is just new extra work, we all got to suck it up and deliver. Yeah, that happens. Invariably, there's going to be some of those things that get piled on because there may be more critical activities than capacity allows for, but you've got to really minimize that. And so, understanding the current risk, understanding how the transaction changes the existing risk profile, understanding how that intersects with risk appetite of leadership, understanding how that contributes to your workload, and being willing to trade off other things from your workload so that you don't overwhelm your team. That's kind of the approach that I take.
Thank you for that. And just to pivot a little, like industry discourse increasingly questions whether the traditional CISO title carries outdated IT connotations that undermine strategic capability. Is there a strategic value in modern leaders adopting titles like Chief Resilience Orchestrator to better communicate business impact? Or you see a lot of fluff there too?
I don't think it matters what people call you as long as they call you. And I think that in many cases, people don't call the security person. It has nothing to do with their title. It has everything to do with how they approach the role. Forever we were told, don't be Dr. No. I don't know that we've really shed that persona, not just the perception, but the reality of it. I think there are still a lot of compliance driven programs who have leadership that just insist that this is the way it is because that's the way it should be, and don't feel comfortable making those kind of risk-based conversation and trade-offs that we just talked about. So you could brand somebody in that way as the chief happiness officer, and people still aren't going to invite you to the party unless maybe you make a cake. So the title doesn't matter so much. The persona and the way that you approach your role, the absence of empathy or the presence of empathy, willingness to collaborate or the willingness to insist. These are counter indicators. You can pick which one is going to get invited to things and carried into conversations, and whose advice is going to be listened to. Somebody who's just focused on pointing out everyone else's mistakes versus somebody who's there to help them overcome those mistakes and give them the capabilities. I've said this a bunch of times, but you can't hold someone accountable unless you help them become able, right? So focus on helping people, focus on building people's capabilities, and then it doesn't matter what they can call you chief cook or bottle washer. It doesn't matter. You're going to be respected because you're adding value, and people will see that.
A regulatory evolution has dramatically increased executive personal accountability. How do CISOs or security leaders like yourself objectively evaluate whether the personal liability exposure exceeds the leadership impact opportunity?
Hmm. You know, maybe I'm naive, but I worry less about this than I see the profession talking about it. I think there's a lot of people who became nervous with a couple, like literally just two very high profile cases. And, I mean, this is maybe a little too candid, but a lot of people want to put themselves in someone else's story, whether that is a company that wants to project itself as some high exposure, high risk environment when they're in fact not. And that leads to them over engineering and gold plating their security program in a way that isn't proportionate. But it also leads to individuals, wanting to be part of somebody else's crisis. And that's just never been for me. So I don't look at the cases of one or two very high profile regulatory actions. Like I've been through an SEC investigation. I've been through a multi-year SEC investigation. I've been through a UK regulatory investigation. I never felt any kind of personal liability from those. I get that it exists. I certainly wouldn't want to be outside of a D&O policy's umbrella of coverage, but I'm also aware that most D&O policies are not going to give you adequate coverage if you're in an environment like those high profile cases have been. So you do what you can, but at the end of the day, it's a personal choice. Are you comfortable being in the chair, or do you just want the salary and the benefits and the cachet that comes with it? To me, all of the good things come with the potential risk, and it's not. It's not unusual if you're the head of HR and a workforce action goes wrong. People are going to knock on your door. If you're the chief operating officer and you have a major outage, people are going to knock on your doors. We say we want a seat at the table, then let's act like we belong and act like we can shoulder the responsibilities that come with it.
Thank you for that. And mergers frequently expose fundamental limitation in managed security service provider models. From a strategic leadership perspective, are MSSPs structurally positioned to deliver in modern AI-driven security operations, and all the more in a M&A kind of a situation?
Well, I think they struggle in an M&A conversation situation, no different a way than an in-house security team. You've got basically two companies crashing together and all of the complexity that comes from that. From a security perspective, like, is this event normal? Is this an abnormality that we need to investigate? If we need to investigate it, how do we find the owner of some new system that we don't even know if it's needed anymore? If we find the owner, how does that person know how to participate in a process that they've never been a part of? And so, it's difficult. It's difficult for anyone, but for an MSSP, it's difficult even still because they're not part of either company. And so they're on the outside looking in, trying to solve all these problems and navigate that complexity from a little bit of an abstracted layer. So I don't envy them. I think it is harder, but I don't think it necessarily, to me, it doesn't necessarily question or cause me to question the relevance of an MSSP. I just think it's another area. If you're leveraging one, then you've got to work with your partner during your integration planning and execution to make sure that they are best positioned to navigate those mazes.
And effective risk communication requires precision, calibration. How do CISOs communicate cyber risk compelling enough to drive action while avoiding the paralysis of necessary business innovation?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question, and it's something we struggle with. The language you'll hear is we need to speak in business terms, but I don't think that a lot of cyber leaders understand what that means. You know, a lot of them just translate it into, I'm going to speak in dollars and cents instead of security metrics, incidents, mean time to address issues, or whatever that might be. I'm just going to translate all that into dollars and cents. One, that's really difficult to do. And two, it's really hard to be credible when you're doing it because it is so difficult. And very often we don't have very good data to make those translations in the first place. So I think we then continue to struggle. And what I've always interpreted that to mean, speaking in business terms, is one, making sure that what I'm talking about is relevant to the business and that I'm focused on the same things that the leadership that I'm talking to are focused on: customer attraction or revenue growth or operating efficiency or whatever that is. And how does the cyber story connect to that? To me, that's the foundation of business terms is you're talking about the business, not talking about cyber with a business accent. And then the second thing is we're upside down. Many technical people are upside down in the way that they convey information. They start with all this data and then they come to a conclusion. So it's like, I saw this, I learned this, I did this action, therefore I think that. And that buildup is very technical talk. But it falls short with many business leaders and can in fact make you seem less confident and capable, where business leaders like bottom line, right? Give me the bottom line up front. And they trust us. They hired us to do these jobs. So it's almost like, why are you telling me all these steps you took to reach the conclusion? I hope you did, but I'm not interested. What's the conclusion? More importantly, what do I need to do? What are you asking me to do? And we are very uncomfortable with that part of it. So we overwhelm people with data. We give them a conclusion that by that point they maybe have lost the plot, but we fail to follow the conclusion with and therefore you need to do X differently or start doing or stop doing Y and Z. So, that's important. And I think instead of the data, we need to focus more on the story. Like, why does what I'm asking you to do matter? How does it make your life easier, or help the customer embrace our product or service more effectively? And that to me is putting the problem in business language, business terms, like talking about a business objective, talking about how what we're proposing is going to improve our ability to deliver that objective, and then asking a very specific and concrete request. And then you follow through on that to make sure those things are committed to and delivered on.
Yeah, makes sense. And I can also resonate because more than often I've seen like people come with that engineer mindset, and that's why they want to bring a lot of data. And then I like that analogy of the upside down approach. And just to touch upon the SOC side a little bit more, now AI agent proliferation accelerates dramatically post merger as organizations consolidate capabilities. How should CISOs architect the operating model for integrating autonomous AI agents into their security operations centers?
Well, you tell me. I think this is something people are going to be experimenting with all of 2026 and maybe even into 2027. The industry is going to be evolving. Look at Claude and Claude Code and Claude Cowork. It didn't exist 6-7 months ago, and now it's like amazing. Skills, are a hot new trend, but also a major area of vulnerabilities. And skills didn't exist that long ago. Before them, it was MCP, and who knows what's next. So I think in general, the AI landscape, particularly around agentic AI, is evolving to the extent that there's no real state of the art. There's just this emerging chaos of lots of different approaches, and that'll settle down eventually. People will decide this is sort of the reasonably best way to do this. Is good enough anyway, and we're going to start building some solutions. In the SOC, you have, like many of the things we talked about today, multiple contexts. You've got to learn how, as a SOC analyst, to monitor and secure AI, and that's very difficult because of the nature of LLMs, particularly. One of the I think two things. One, they're deterministic versus probabilistic, right? So that whole challenge of consistency in the output, you're not going to get it. The other one is that the data plane and the administrative plane are mingled, and so it's that's what's behind prompt injection and the like. That's an architectural limitation. Both of those are architectural limitations. And so they both make monitoring appropriate usage of an LLM challenging, maybe even impossible, because there's so many ways through natural language to craft a prompt that ends up being malicious. Skills files, we talked about them as a really interesting development, beneficial, but looking at the repositories, so many of these skills files are either flawed or outright malicious. And so you have people who are ingesting these as if they're blessed, when in fact they're no more safe than random code off the internet. So you got the challenge of how do we build an environment where we have visibility into the usage of agents by employees, and we can detect whether that usage goes into a way that we're not comfortable with, and we have the ability to interact with and interdict that inappropriate behavior. That's all in the stuff. That's an enormous challenge, and one which I'm not sure is readily solvable. But on the other hand, there will be pressure on the SOC to adopt agentic capabilities themselves, whether those are commercially developed. There's a couple of these hyperautomation platforms that are offering agents, and you'll see agentic capabilities added to a lot of the SIM, a lot of the EDR, and probably every product will have its own kind of remediation or monitoring agents. There's going to be a flood of tools that they might need to learn how to use and decide whether they apply. And then you're going to see, agentic frameworks that people build themselves. Maybe you're going to see moving away from SOAR and into more of a data lake concept, and having an agent that's acting on a data lake through an LLM. So you may see a fundamental re-architecture of the monitoring environment that SOC relies on. I think all that will be happening simultaneously. You're going to have the business enable and embracing LLMs and agents. You're going to have the SOC being pressed to do that themselves, and then you're going to have the vendor space offering 1,000 different permutations of what an agent might be, and we're going to ask an already busy group of people to make sense of that all. That's, I think, the inevitability of 2026 and into 2027.
And competitive differentiation in AI native networking increasingly hinges on security innovation. How does AI native cybersecurity create sustainable strategic advantage against established market leaders, in your opinion?
Well, I think it empowers experimentation. I think that's a really neat thing, because the established vendors, any established vendor, can get a little complacent. They can say what we have is a really locked in market and a customer base that's captured, and they're going to stick with us. But I think these AI enabled startups and product offerings, they're going to introduce capabilities that are going to be compelling enough that organizations are going to be willing to do something maybe they wouldn't have. Maybe I'm not going to switch from EDR A to EDR B for any reason. I mean, they're six of one and a half dozen of the other. They're much of the same to me. But if you told me that I have the ability in a new product to automate 80% of the work that today I'm doing manually, that may give me pause and cause me to reassess my decision to stick with the status quo. So I think that there'll be a lot of disruption because of the new capabilities and the compelling sort of outcomes that they're producing.
And because you mentioned about disruption, in the era of SEC cyber disclosure requirements, extended incidents test true organizational resilience. Now, what is your executive stakeholder management framework or approach for navigating multi-day disruptions?
You know, I've been blessed to work at organizations where there were established crisis management capabilities. I think if you don't have one, you should build one, just like we talked about in so many of the contexts around the M&A. You have to be in a position to leverage relationships before you need to leverage those relationships. It's very difficult to build a relationship under the barrel of a gun or when you're fighting a fire. So it's better to stop and say today, if there were a crisis, what would I do? Who would I need? And be thoughtful about it. Uh, and go talk to those people and say, like, what would we work together? What would you do? What would you ask me to do? What would you expect me to do that I'm not prepared to do? And let's make sure we write all this down and start building, even if it's a very high level outline of what we would do. You're going to involve your legal team. You might involve outside counsel. You're going to involve your corporate communications team or people. You're going to involve your executives from your product and operations. And so you got to have a way to bring the right representatives from those groups together. They have to know what's expected of them, and you have to know what they expect of you. You've got to have a way to sort of report out from that group in a way that answers the questions of leadership that's not necessarily directly involved so that they're not banging on people's door. You've got to have the ability to sense where that all needs to change because customers are going to insert themselves in the process and come to you with questions that you hadn't anticipated. And it's not good. It's not good enough to say, well, we have a report out at the end of the week. We'll get that to the customer. You know, we're going to get a response to the customer today or to the impacted party today or the regulator today. So you got to have the ability to sort of flex and pivot a little bit, but you also have to have an expectation, like Mr. and Mrs. Chief Executive. We will report out every other day in the midst of a crisis. It will be at the end of the day. It will be a format that contains this information, and they can look at it and go, "Well, that's not enough for me. I need more frequent updates," or "That's not the kind of information I'm going to need." All of that is much better done like now in the calm before the storm.
And what I also interpret is post-incident leadership requires careful sequencing with so many moving parts and so many stakeholders involved, which kind of
Uh,
also gets me thinking, how do we balance the need for rapid operational recovery with comprehensive root cause investigation and analysis?
yeah. Well, it's really nice if you can have different teams working on different things. I know a lot of companies aren't big enough, don't have the resources to do that. But like when I one of my first jobs at a help desk, we had outages and we dealt with those outages. And the way that we handled those outages, you had one team who was responsible for communications and engagement, and you had another team that was doing the technical remediation and uplifts and all those things. And then you had somebody who sat in both war rooms or conference bridges or whatever structure you have for those teams to work. And so could represent one to the other without, for example, the communications people flooding into the technical people or the technical people feeling like, how am I going to go get this update delivered? You had a little bridge. And that was a nice structure. It didn't take a lot of people, but it allowed the teams to focus on what they were expert at. And I think it's nice too in the like post-mortem versus the reporting that takes place to just separate those things with a little bit of an air gap. Let the teams focus on the problem at hand and don't distract one with the problems of the other to the extent that you can get away with it.
Thank you so much once again, Drew. So that brings us to the signature rapid fire section of this particular podcast.
Okay.
So, what is the single most common and most avoidable merger cybersecurity integration mistake you observe across enterprises?
Rapid fire, that means I should have a rapid response. The most common mistake that I've seen is making assumptions, I guess. You look at a company that you're acquiring, you can never do all the due diligence you need at the detail level for every organization. So, I mean, you're going to get the big picture of that acquired company. And for a lot of people, they're going to make assumptions based on who that company is, the size they are, how mature that you think they are, and plan accordingly. So I would just say go in with your eyes wide open. Don't make any assumptions about who it is, what you're getting, what they need, and how much work you have to do, and just plan to do that work as quickly as you can, either post transaction or if you're lucky and you can get into pre-transaction conversations, There's all sorts of rules and regulations around gun jumping and this and the like. But in many cases, you can have some degree of conversation that allows you to plan better. Just don't make assumptions.
And what is the most immediate high impact AI security capability that CISOs or security leaders should prioritize for leadership leverage?
The most high impact thing we can do, I think today, it seems to be like getting our arms around identity. It's not really an AI thing per se, but as we think about the explosion of identities in the context of agents across a citizen developer environment, then being able to provide those people with a safe way to use permissions, to access sensitive data, to transact that data with other people, like that's a huge potential hurdle, and one I think that cyber needs to learn how to overcome fairly quickly.
And what has been the most significant quantifiable leadership advantage you have observed from an empathy driven cybersecurity team management?
I think, I think that all the benefits are amazing. The ability for people to not sort of dislike you, but the reality is people prefer to work with people they like versus people who are competent or versus people who are super effective. At the end of the day, if you're prickly or if you're difficult to work with or if people don't think that you're on their side, they're going to exclude you from a lot of conversations that you don't want to be excluded from. And at the end of the day, you're going to seem selfish and self-motivated. And if you take the other approach and you are empathetic and you do put yourself in other people's shoes and they do realize that you're here to help and support them, they'll return the favor. And when you need a hand, they'll offer it. And when you need a boost, they'll provide it. When you need some insights, they'll do their best to give it to you. So, it's real simple. If you help people, they want to help you back. And if you understand where people are and focus on a shared goal that we all have and we're all working together to achieve, instead of like you're not compliant, you're definitely needing to be chastised and shamed, and we're going to put you on a leaderboard at the bottom. None of those things build good relationships. They all build friction. So put yourself in somebody else's shoes and feel like what would feel like if you were struggling to deliver your main goal, somebody came and piled some additional work on your back and then told your leadership how much you were failing at delivering it. You wouldn't like that. They wouldn't like it any more than you do. So don't do it to people.
And last question of this segment. In your view, what does the term cybersecurity fundamentally evolve to mean by 2030?
Gosh, well, I'm not sure what it means today. I still don't know what a cyber is, but we are doing a bang up job of trying to secure them, whatever these cybers are. So, to me, the world is digitizing. And our field, whether you call it information security, infosec, computer security, or cybersecurity, our field is about making sure that tomorrow looks a lot like today. That people can have a reasonable expectation that they understand the world that they're operating in and they're not constantly churning and thrashing from state to state. So, you can call that what you want. I like to use the trust moniker. I want us to keep the promises we make to ourselves, to our customers, to our regulators, to our shareholders, and other interested parties. We want those interested parties have confidence that we're keeping those promises, and I want to be able to demonstrate in a very transparent way. I think transparency demands excellence, and I think it's a great justification for having a program of the type that most security leaders want to produce. And we want to understand the problems and solve the problems that are material to our business. And so again, less about the name, more about the outcomes that we achieve. And that's where I'd hope that as we progress in maturity as a field, that we become anchored less on the deploying of technology and more on the achieving of business outcomes.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad we had this discussion. Now, if each listener, whether CISO, security leader, security operations guy, or business executive, takes away one concrete leadership action from our conversation to implement this week, what would you recommend?
I lean in on the empathy side of things. Take a moment, step out of your own shell, try to understand the motives, the situations, the pressures, the capabilities of the people that you're working with. And to the extent that you have more than they have, like you're a technical expert and they're not technical at all, one, be willing to share that in a very generous kind of way, but also recognize that they have some things that you don't have. Like they might be a really good marketing person and you don't know much about marketing. They might be really good at sales and you need to learn more about sales. So, don't I've heard too many cyber people say, like, we're the smartest people in the room. And that might be true in one context, but only one context. There's a lot of other contexts of intelligence and capability. And if you go into a situation where you've got that kind of attitude, it's a big turnoff to everyone around you. And they don't care how smart you are. They care how much you care. Somebody said this, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. So take some time and actually pay attention to the people that you work with.
Thank you so much for that. And where is the optimal place for our audience to follow your ongoing perspectives on cybersecurity leadership and strategic risk management? And what would be the best way to reach out to you if somebody wants to?
Well, the only place to follow anything is on LinkedIn. I try to be active on LinkedIn. I want to have a community that we can all be a part of and learn from each other in, and I do my best to contribute to that community, and many others do as well. So you'll find me there, often commenting, occasionally posting, sometimes sharing other people's posts. And it's probably the best way to reach me as well. I try to respond to all the messages I receive, and not always immediately, but eventually, and usually try to be quick about it. So I'm always happy to connect on LinkedIn, to have a conversation, to subsequently jump on a call and have a chat. I learn as much from talking to people as I do from people talking to me. So I think it's wonderful, and I encourage that.
Thank you so much once again, Drew. It was lovely catching up again, having a
Great to
conversation.
see. Yeah.
And I appreciate you taking out time. On a closing note, any quick word before we wrap up?
No, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I've enjoyed the questions. They challenged me to think about some things in a deeper way. So I really thought that was good. I hope that the audience benefited from some of the answers.
Thank you so much once again. And that kind of brings us to the end of this podcast. For more, stay tuned, and we'll be dropping more episodes in very near future. Thank you once again for your time. And thank you, Drew, once again for doing this.
Thank you, Ashish, for hosting this.
Thanks for joining CISO Chair. Subscribe for global perspectives and bold conversations on cybersecurity. Stay secure, stay inspired. See you in the next episode.